Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy. I'm your host, Killian Hobbs, journalism director at think-liberty.com. You can follow us on 6 major social media platforms and listen to our podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. For today's episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy, I wanted to cover a very aggravating aspect of dialogue, which is dogmatism. I find that dogmatism itself, when people have a very dogmatic approach to their philosophical ideas or to their political stances, that it's the greatest cause of strife, the greatest barrier to having anything resembling a cohesive conversation, and probably one of the key reasons that any good form of discourse or dialogue between people ends up dying or becoming pointless. So I'm going to break the episode into a few different parts here. One of the key things is explaining how people can be dogmatic with ideologies or with their specific stances, candidates they support, so on and so forth. I'm going to break down the dogmatism itself. I'm going to break down why this dogmatism is so stifling to real dialogue and real conversation, as well as ways for you to recognize how this comes about and whether or not you're guilty of it. And if so, what can be done to try to correct a conversation, even if there is some form of ideological dogma in play. So to start off, what do I mean by dogmatic? Now, obviously, when you hear the phrase dogmatic, you think of the strictness of religious doctrine. Dogma, where we get the phrase or the term dogmatic from, is a specific stance of the Roman Catholic Church, which is to state that the Word of God is incontrovertibly true. There is no question to it. There is to be no questioning of it. Now, this translates quite often into the political and ideological sphere. People will become so convinced of a certain ideology that they won't even listen to opposition to it, or they'll enter into a conversation thinking that this is an opportunity for them to teach everyone that they're right, rather than thinking that there's any chances that they're going to actually learn from the conversation they're about to enter. So think of a normal conversation you might be having with someone about politics. You'll talk to them about an issue like, say, gun control. That's always a hot topic option for a conversation and something that comes up more often than it should, really. But you'll have a conversation about gun control. You'll be going back and forth talking about, the pros and the cons, but eventually one of the sides is just going to hammer down. They're going to say, it's a Second Amendment right. Anything else doesn't matter, blah, 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 and start going into a complete tangent on the matter. Whereas people on the opposite side you'll run into, they'll say, I don't care what the rights are. I don't care what the piece of paper says. People are dying. Kids are dying. This isn't a question anymore. This isn't a conversation anymore. Things just need to happen. Both sides in a debate like that can take a dogmatic approach where they're not open to possibilities. They're not open to ways that we can go about fixing things without completely trouncing on the concepts the other side might have. In a situation like gun control, you can talk about maybe more gun awareness, more knowledge behind the usage of devices. You can talk about better security in places that are more likely to have a mass shooting of some sort, such as better security in a mall or at schools or at concerts, or I guess with this week's news at synagogues, more people actually arming themselves, which would be more to the 2A argument. But again, there's multiple approaches that you can take to a topic like that. There's a lot of nuanced positions that can fit inside of that type of conversation. However, the dogmatic crowd, once they've settled on an answer, there is no other answer in their mind. So the reason this happens, the reason people get dogmatic with some of their ideologies, at least in my experience that I've seen, is that they might have gone through some of the argumentatives back and forth. They might have had some of these discussions before, and they've reached an answer that they think is 100%. That's the answer. That's got to be it. I've gone back and forth on this so many times. There's no more options. There's no other opinions I need to weigh. Everything's been weighed, and my position is completely coming from a place of knowledge. Even if you've gone back and forth and had these debates and you've come to some sort of answer on something, that doesn't change that you still need to be able to discuss it with other people who may or may not be of the same position as you. The problem is that people will get into this mindset where they've settled on this idea where they've attached themselves to it, but they don't bother to express it in a way that actually garners support for it. They don't bother to explain these ideas and actually go into the depths of them, or perhaps even comprehend that, hey, an opposed opinion might exist and it can have its merits. Instead of considering anything else having these merits or having alternative options be available, they might still think that theirs is the superior option, but when people get into a dogmatic phase, they will completely block out whatever any other option might be if it has any chance of interfering with what they consider to be the truth, saying that we need to defend the Second Amendment no matter what is the truth, period and full stop. Which is really funny when you consider that a lot of people that support gun rights are also libertarian, who believe that the rights of the people shouldn't be restricted to a simple piece of paper. That's the other part that's interesting with a lot of dogmatic thought, is that it very quickly leads to cognitive dissonance. They'll accept other items that are contradictory, but they refuse to acknowledge contradictions in these ideological flows simply because it would invalidate what they've considered to be the absolute truth of their stances. I'll take minarchy, for example. There's a very good example of this to be found in some people who support minarchy. In the concept of minarchy, there's a lot of a push for still having a form of state, still maintaining basic services such as police, borders, military, leaving most of the rest of the things to the free market and leaving the restrictionary aspect of government in markets at the absolute bare minimal, if not present at all. That's a very bare bones explanation of minarchism, but effectively leaving a night watchman type state. Now, what's interesting here, and this is where you see some of the potential cognitive dissonance, or where you see some of the dogmatic ideologies blinding people to their own statements, to the words that are leaving their mouths, you'll find people who will defend minarchy, but they'll stress the need for force, the need for power, the need for absolute control. When the whole idea of any libertarian thought, whether it's classical liberal minarchy or anarcho-capitalism or any other form of anarchy there, the whole point is to not have massive central authoritative force. But they'll get to a point where instead of admitting that there's other options available, or acknowledging that different systems might be in play or different social norms could be developed where the concept of a state may not be necessary, instead of understanding that and working from that perspective, they will almost invalidate their own stances and beliefs just to make sure that they've defended the concept of retaining a state. So they'll throw out the idea of it being a night watchman state or a very bare bones, just enough to defend, just enough to protect and keep order. They'll throw all of that out the window in the course of their argumentation solely to make sure that they defend the idea of there being a state at all. And in turn, they'll end up defending and arguing for massive, unquestionable, authoritative power. You see this in every type of dogmatic argument for an ideology. You see this with anarchists quite often. One thing that gets brought up quite often from opponents to anarcho-capitalist idea is the supposed pipeline from anarcho-capitalism to the alt-right. And the reason that such a pipeline exists is because you have it where people get so entrenched in the ideas of anarcho-capitalist philosophy, so entrenched in the ideas of the basic tenets of there has to be a free market, society has to work this way, there has to be some sort of cross-connection between things in the way that Rothbard said or the way that Mises said, it has to work out this way. If it doesn't look exactly like something that Milton Friedman described, then we're all doing it wrong and it needs to be stopped and corrected. These same people, they're going to say, yay, go Pinochet. They're going to say, that it's okay if the state steps on the rights of people that they disagree with because those people are a threat to the eventual coming of this almost utopic age of anarcho-capitalism. When if you talk to anyone who's principled when it comes to anarcho-capitalism, the first thing they'll tell you is that anyone who's utopian is a fucking idiot. That's just a fact. If you believe in anarcho-capitalism and you've got a utopist view of it, please get off my side. You're just making it worse. It's harder to explain and argue for these ideas if there's people out there that are taking positions that make absolutely no sense and do not fit the reality of what the concept is. That said, people will take this dogmatic approach with their ideology to the degree that they end up invalidating themselves in order to defend it. Going back to the anarcho-capitalism to alt-right pipeline, what happens is people get so assured of themselves. They'll become so focused on the idea of a laissez-faire market, the idea of no state, being left alone, no one interfering, no commies, that they'll end up supporting a massive authoritative state to make sure that it doesn't happen. They'll take their idea to the point where they end up supporting actual proper fascism just to make sure that commies don't interfere with their free markets. That makes no sense. We see this with, if you go through different libertarian groups on any form of social media, just go see how they feel about the recent election in Brazil. There was an election of an actual fascist who said that he wants to bring forth a Christian theocracy inside the country. They've already gone into universities looking for anything related to socialist propaganda or anti-state propaganda, and they want it completely removed, questioning people. They're already making moves that are literally fascist policy moves. They are an actual fascist regime. Now, there's people who are in different libertarian circles that are defending this simply because it's a fuck you to the commies. They're throwing away their own guiding principles simply because they become so dogmatic in defending anything capitalistic that they're completely okay with actual fascism if it means that communists and socialists get taken down a peg. There's so many people that are unprincipled in their ideologies that become dogmatic that it makes the straw men real. When people come up with, straw man arguments to beat on, these dogmatic personalities make these straw men real. You could pull something out of the aether and make it an argument against, something that the left would have said, or something that progressives would have said, or something that the alt-right would have said. The problem is that Poe's law is real, and it's these dogmatic personalities that will regurgitate these arguments because they'll say anything to defend what they believe is their incontrovertible truth. You cannot argue with these types of people, and you can't have any form of fruitful dialogue with them. You might be able to talk to them for the purposes of getting their opinion on something, seeing the knowledge that they have, so on and so forth. But if you're trying to have a dialogue where minds can change, you're not going to get anywhere with these people. I'm not one for writing off a conversation with somebody. I think that you can always find a method to have a meaningful conversation with someone. But when it comes to people who are this type of dogmatic, it's very difficult to get anything out of the conversation unless you are designing every single statement to fit the personality and mindset of the person you're talking to, which frankly, for the sake of potentially converting or slightly changing the mind of just one individual, I'm not 100% sure if that's the best use of time or effort, especially when a lot of these people have goldfish memories. And even if you change their minds slightly on certain parts, as soon as they go back to their own digital safe spaces and they're back amongst their own people who also are dogmatic about these different ideas, it's all just going to go in one ear and out the other. They'll move on and they'll be back in the next thread saying the exact same dogmatic sound bites about the exact same thing over and over again. And there's no progress to be made there. At that point, all you can do is you can either use them as a touch base for knowledge on their side of what kind of arguments they're using or what kind of things that they might believe in, just for a different perspective. But if you're, again, trying to have anything meaningful come out of a discussion with people like that, unfortunately, there's little you can really do. Now, that's not to say that everyone who's dogmatic is a lost cause. Quite often, people will get very dogmatic with an idea because of a different reason. They'll be dogmatic not necessarily because of the ideology itself, but it might be something personal. It might be something more specific to the individual itself than something that's really grabbing them with the ideology. A great example of this would be, let's say, David Hogg. I'll use him. If you don't remember, he was one of these survivors from a school shooting a while back that immediately hopped on the media networks and started to discuss gun control and restricting firearms sales and usage and more safe spaces, gun-free zones, etc., etc. Now, his reasoning makes perfect sense. He was at a school. There was a school shooting. People died. They were some of his classmates, if he knew any of them. I'm not 100% sure of the personal relationships there. But it makes perfect sense that someone that would be in a situation like that would have the stances that they have. Now, he was wrong and his arguments for it sucked. And there was also one of his other classmates that for some reason didn't quite get as much media attention, but that's another story for another day, that had actually challenged him to a debate about gun ownership because he was there and was also at school the day of the shooting. And he still said, yeah, no, gun rights are proper. That's the way it should be. I forget his name at the moment, but if you look into the history of the whole shooting, you'll find the guy that I'm talking about. It's a debate that still hasn't happened. I should make note of that too. But you'll have it where these individuals might come from something like that, and that's where their passion for the idea comes from. That's where the weight behind it, where it has to be true, the solution has to be right, this stance, there's no other stance that makes sense, otherwise it's just evil, which no ideology in and of itself is evil. That's I'm not the biggest fan of Stirner, but I gotta say that's pretty spooky to say that something's evil. Something may not be the most effective. Something may not sit well with the morals of some people, considering that, in my view, morality is subjective. So some people might support the morality behind a certain set of actions, whereas other people may not. But you can start off by trying to understand where some of these people are coming from and see if there's anything in that you can use to break the conversation away from what's tethering them to their ideology. So using the David Hogg type as an example, he's tied to the anti-gun stances because he was involved in a school shooting. He was there when it happened and people died. Okay. So at that point, you can start having a discussion not about, well, screw you, Second Amendment rights, screw you, we're done, that's it, that's all. That's not going to get anywhere. But you can talk to them about, well, what if there was better security? What if there was better defenses? I mean, the state option, which was the sheriff that was on site, the guy that was there was a coward. He didn't go in. I mean, I shouldn't say coward because nobody wants to run into the middle of a shooting scene, but I mean, that's literally his job in that point. Like at that point, that is his job. His job is to go in and deal with the situation. And if that includes people shooting, well, you're an officer of the law. That's your job. So in this case, the state dropped the ball. So you can use that argument to say that maybe the state shouldn't be the only people that are in control of these things. You can use that angle to say that, maybe more people would have survived the encounter had there been more people on site armed and ready to defend against such an attack. Now, this may not necessarily work against people who are more dogmatic in this ideology because they're just so entrenched in this idea that regular people shouldn't have guns and that's what they've set their foot down on. But then you can call that out. You can go at them for saying that, okay, you're saying that regular people shouldn't have guns, only the police should have guns. Okay. So in that case, you're asking for one of two things then. If you really want to prevent another tragedy like that, you're either asking for a far heavier police presence in all places, or you are asking for the impossible to take place, which would be the complete end of all forms of weapon manufacturing in the United States of America. That's not something that's actually possible. So, realistically, if you're looking at a solution out of this ideology, you're asking for an increased excessive police presence. Now, what's interesting is the same people that'll fight for that because of a school shooting or whatever else are usually the same people that'll support something like Black Lives Matter, and they don't want excessive police everywhere. They don't want police to have the kind of power that they have. So how do you have it where the police are the only ones with power? Their power needs to practically be absolute, and their positions need to be absolutely everywhere. And yet you don't want them to have that, but you want them to have that, but you don't want them to have that. This is the type of cognitive dissonance that I'm referring to that comes from dogmatic positions. So while you can try to create scenarios and try to explain these ideas away, if someone is truly dogmatic in their ideas, they'll argue with whatever argument they can stick to a wall, even though it spits in the face of other things that they might stand for. And now you can press them on that, and you can try to push them into a little bit of a corner and try to do it tactfully so that you don't necessarily scare them off or kick in the flight or fight response from being cornered. But the best thing that you can do is try to lay things out as clearly as possible. Try to get to some form of solution, or at least present alternative solutions and see what can be done in that vein, and try to take the discourse as far as you can. Like I mentioned earlier, sometimes when people are dogmatic, there's just not anything you can really do. And it really boils down to how much of your time you're willing to invest in someone that is dogmatically defending their ideas. If the person looks to be, very sure of themselves, however open to discussion, then that's a completely good use of time. That's worth talking to them about and being involved with them and trying to get to an answer when it comes to dialogue back and forth. You can break through the dogmatic ideas that are there. You can break through those. You can get to some sort of resolution. You can further the conversation if people are open to it. But signs such as the cognitive dissonance, denying it if it's pointed out, being unwilling to change or acknowledge that these things are happening, or that these struggles between their own ideas are taking place because they're so fervently sure that they need to defend one central point. That's, again, where discourse dies. I have had some success, not always a success, but I've had some success by trying to tackle what that core central point is. Everything else that stems from it, the cognitive dissonance, the wild to somewhat unfeasible arguments that might come out, all of that generally stems from one central point that they're actually trying to defend. And if you can get to that singular central point, then that usually is where you can get the most ground. That's where you can gain from the conversation by figuring out what that point is that your opponent has, and then being able to work through the logistics from that perspective. Because sometimes you can come to a solution that still fits that type of truth that they're trying to hold on to, and you can progress the conversation. You can actually have some form of growth. You can have some form of actual discourse with them. But again, sometimes it's just not worth that time investment. Now, when it comes to you yourself, you, along with everyone else out there, doesn't think that they're the person that's dogmatic. Nobody thinks that they're dogmatic in their own ideas. Everyone thinks that they have an open mind and that they're willing to have their minds changed, and they're great to have discourse, and they just care about truth. And, that's a crock. I hate to put it in plain terms here, but that's just a crock of shit. Nobody is 100% open on every single topic like that, or at least very few people actually are. There's some things that you'll reach a point with them where they say, this is the answer to it. You can't change my mind. You've probably said those exact words at some point in some form of discourse with someone where you've said, you can't change my mind on this. Well, if we're dealing with ideologies, we're not dealing with facts. An ideology is very separate from a fact. It might be built on a fact. It might be based around a certain set of facts that exist, but the ideology itself is simply that. It's an ideology. It's a thought process. It's a concept, all of which can all be changed. All of them can be challenged. All of them can be augmented and evolve and move past the original meanings or the original ideas as discourse and ideas evolve. Take a look at, take a look at modern libertarianism. Libertarianism, its origin is left-wing. The definition of left-wing was anti-state. That was the defining line. That's what made a libertarian, was someone who was not an authoritarian. It was someone who was against the state, against the king. It was someone who wanted the power to the people, didn't want government or heavy government or anything like that. That was a libertarian. Nowadays, though, libertarian also includes capitalist ideas because the dialogue has evolved. Just the same as we've seen from the USSR and Mao's China, the idea of the left has evolved. The left is no longer just anti-state. The left also includes very heavy state concepts such as the dictatorship of the proletariat that came out of Marx. Because you have to note that left-wing as well as some socialist ideas and some communal ideas existed before Marx did. A lot of people forget that and they think that he's the source of all things communistic, but there was a lot of source material and ideas that existed in that vein well before him that are a little bit more in tune with what we would consider libertarianism today. But I mean, there's even libertarianism as a party, we consider it to be, very property right driven, very capitalistic, very anti-authority, anti-state. But even in that umbrella ideology, we've got people who are, anarchists. We've got people who are libsocs. We've got people who are classical liberals. We've got people who are neoliberals. But they all consider themselves libertarian because the dialogue is open, because there's room to have these discussions and have different developments of these ideas. But we're all tied by that central point. We're all tied by the concept of less government, more freedom. We all take different approaches. We have different angles to it. And it's important to have these types of dialogues. It allows people to develop and change the way they think, to actually test ideas against others, and actually try to reach some form of truth that's worth defending. Now, as I mentioned, I would say what to do if you yourself are dogmatic. I said that was one of the points that I would cover. Really, after everything I've explained here, you just have to switch my examples. And you have to ask yourself if any of the things that I've described in the form of an opposition fit you. Now, right off the bat, almost everybody listening to this is going to say no, but ask yourself if that fits you, if that's something that you've done, if there's an item out there that makes you throw everything else aside to make sure that that central point gets defended no matter what, you are dogmatic about that point. If you are 100% cannot change your mind, there is no argument against it when it comes to capitalism. If there is no other possible way that things can be organized and people shouldn't be able to organize themselves in socialist ways and it's all going to fail and it's all terrible, blah, 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 blah. If that's the way that you view it and that's the way that you defend it, then you are dogmatic about it. It's okay to say that free markets would be a superior option. I agree. It's okay to say that private property norms, as capitalists define it, is better than the private property versus public property versus personal property divides that some socialist and communist groups will take. It's okay to believe that. I agree with that as well. However, if your stance in an argument, if your stance in a debate is that 100%, nope, you cannot change my mind. This is a truth. This is a fact. This isn't open for discussion. This isn't open for debate. There is no question that this is accurate. If that is your stance and you've ever had that stance on any idea, you need to reel it back a little bit and ask yourself, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm wrong? What if there is an argument out there that's better, an option out there that's better than what I stand for, than what I believe in? It's okay to acknowledge that. It's okay to be willing to change your entire belief system based on superior arguments that come your way. A few years back at this point, I'm going to say probably about 5 or 6 years ago, I think I mentioned this on a previous podcast, or at least in some of my writing on think-liberty.com there. I used to be more socialist minded. I used to believe that there needs to be a state and the state needs to have the power to accomplish things. I used to believe that it would be much better if, everyone paid fair share in taxes and people got taxed just a little bit more, especially on the top end, the people that could afford it. I used to believe all that stuff. But I went into debate willing to have my mind changed, willing to face better arguments and test my ideas against them. In doing so, in a pretty short period of time, I ended up coming around to the idea of libertarianism itself, and then slowly but surely testing the concepts of the state that I was still defending. Going through those, I found myself more in alliance with anarcho-capitalism. These changes can take place if you go into the debates willing to have your mind changed. And sometimes it might even be something that still keeps you in the same mindset that you have. But by hearing these new concepts or hearing new explanations or actually having those dialogues, you might be willing to change your mind. You might be able to add to the arguments you have. For example, you can still be a libertarian and believe in the concept that certain forms of rights need to be upheld, but maybe you're diehard on natural rights, and then you hear Hayek's social evolutionary rights, something that a lot of people in the TL family are really a big fan of or believe to be the truest source of rights. You could use a dialogue like that as a perfect example of being able to change your mind without having to compromise principles or without having to completely change teams or anything like that, if that's something that you're worried about, because you're still agreeing with the concept of rights. You're just comparing these ideas and trying to come to something that's a little bit closer to the truth. And if the idea that you hold, the concepts, the stances, the ideology itself that you hold, or that, incontroversial truth that you hold yourself to is so fragile that it cannot face that kind of scrutiny, and that you refuse that type of dialogue and you refuse to give any ground when discussing these ideas to see where the conversation might go, then the only advice I can really give to you is that it's time for you to reassess. It's time for you to take a look at what you actually believe in, how all these pieces fit together, and try to put yourself in the shoes of someone who believes the exact opposite of you, and be willing to go into a conversation knowing that you're going to talk to those people and they may have points that invalidate some of the things that you previously held as truth. When it comes to the realm of ideology, nothing is cement. And it's important for all of us in discourse to remember that. As always, just before I close up here, you can go to our website, think-liberty.com. You can hit the little subscribe bell to get the update for all the articles that are coming out at all times. You can go to our shop as well. There's always new shirts and merchandise available there, in case you feel like actually wearing something from the Think Liberty, or if there's just a design that catches your eye and you feel like being able to go into an argument wearing that and just letting people see what you really stand for. If you have any comments or any ideas regarding the episode that you heard today or any of the previous episodes I've done, you can either reach out to us through our different social media feeds on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Mastodon, Steemit, or Minds, or you can email me directly at killian.hobbs@think-liberty.com. As always, if you liked what you heard and you'd like to hear more, I'll see you again next week.